Ted Bundy, a name that still provokes fear and fascination today. Prepare yourself for a story of pain, mystery, and courage. In this video, you will learn the tragic story of Lynda Ann Healy, a brilliant young woman whose life was brutally cut short by one of the most notorious serial killers in history, Ted Bundy. Through her mother's eyes, we will relive the most memorable moments of this story, from the fateful night of her disappearance to the devastating impact her loss brought to the world. If you are passionate about real stories that mix suspense and reflection, subscribe to the channel now. This way, you don't miss any of our impactful content, and leave your like to support our work. Let's dive into this exciting narrative together. Lynda Ann's mother's account begins.
My Lynda, she was always the center of our family. Since she was little, she was a girl full of life, intelligent, and with an energy that lit up any room. When she decided to study psychology at the University of Washington, I couldn't be prouder. She wanted to help people. "I want to make a difference, Mom," she said. She was not just studious. Lynda had a job that made her happy. Every morning, she woke up early to host a radio show about missing persons. Ironic, no? My daughter dedicated her life to trying to help other families find answers, but she ended up becoming one of those lost names that people hear on the radio and move on. Lynda was organized, responsible. I would never have imagined that something so terrible could happen to her. I still remember the last time we spoke on the phone. She was excited, as always, talking about her friends, her classes, and the plans she had for the future. I always told her to be careful, especially in a big city like Seattle. But Lynda laughed, saying she knew how to take care of herself. And now, all I have left are these memories. The old photos, her laugh echoing in my mind. Sometimes I wonder, where did I go wrong? Shouldn't he have allowed her to live away from home? Should I have insisted she come back more often? This guilt, it never goes away. My Lynda is gone, and I can never hold her again. The night my Lynda disappeared is a nightmare I relive every day. I wasn't there, but deep down, it's like I could feel something wrong that night. It was January 30th, 1974. Lynda had left with her friends, as she did from time to time, to enjoy a little. She deserved that. Always so dedicated to her studies and work, sometimes it seemed like she was carrying the world on her shoulders. When she returned home, she was tired but happy, as her roommates said. She chatted briefly with them and, as she always did, got ready for bed. Lynda was methodical. She always followed a routine, changing her clothes, brushing her teeth, and praying. She believed these little things kept her life in order. That night, she went to bed and lay down, probably without imagining that something so monstrous was about to happen. I wonder, did she hear any strange noises? Could it be that she was afraid before? The next morning, the roommates said that everything seemed normal at first glance. The house was silent, as it always was in the mornings. But when one of them noticed that Lynda wasn't in the kitchen, they began to suspect that she had left for work early. This was rare, but not impossible. Hours later, when they realized she didn't show up for the radio show, that's when the panic began. They entered her room and, my God, what they found there was terrifying. The bed was unmade, but in a strange way, as if something had happened there. The pillow and sheets had bloodstains. My girl's blood. But somehow no one in the house heard anything. No screams, no footsteps, nothing. He took her. He snatched her from that room like a predator that acts in the silence of the night. I always wonder, what if someone had woken up? What if there was a locked door that he couldn't get through? Sometimes I blame myself for her being there, so far from home and so vulnerable. She didn't deserve this. No mother should have to imagine her daughter's final moments like this. I try to imagine what happened that night, but it's a pain that never subsides. How did he do it? How could someone break into a house full of people and take a young girl without anyone hearing? Lynda was sleeping in her room upstairs. It was a place where she should be safe. I remember how she described that room to me. "Mom, it's small, but cozy. You can hear the girls laughing throughout the house. But that night, the sound that mattered was not heard. The monster entered without anyone noticing. Some say he used his familiar tactic, pretending to be hurt or needing help to get people to let their guard down. But that night, he didn't need any charade. He just needed silence and darkness. Police believe he attacked her while she slept. Maybe he hit her in the head so she couldn't scream. Maybe Lynda didn't even have time to understand what was happening. This is what torments me. She was there, in what should have been the safest space in the world, and he took her away as if she were a thing, not a person, not my daughter. There were signs of a struggle, but just enough to show that she tried to resist. The pillow had blood stains. He probably dragged her from the bed, wrapped her in something to muffle any noise, and took her downstairs past the other girls who slept without knowing that evil was so close. What breaks my heart is imagining the fear she felt. My girl, who was always so brave, so independent. At that moment, she was defenseless. Did she ask for help? Did he cry? Did you think of me as he took you away? After taking her out of the house, he placed her in the trunk of his car. No one heard the sound of the car leaving. He disappeared into the night, taking Lynda with him. Where to? For days, weeks, months, no one knew. It was as if she had evaporated into thin air. And the worst thing is to think that, while I was sleeping in the safety of my home, he was there with my daughter, in some dark and unknown place. I should have felt something, a premonition, but I didn't feel it. I blame myself for this every day. She was alone, and I wasn't there to protect her. When I found out that Lynda was missing, my world fell apart. I'll never forget the call I got that morning. It was one of her roommates, nervous, saying that Lynda hadn't shown up for work and that no one knew where she was. My heart sank. Lynda was extremely responsible, the type who would even let me know if she was going to be 5 minutes late. Something was wrong, and I knew it. I took the first flight to Seattle. All the way, I clung to the hope that there was some mistake, that she would show up. But when I arrived and entered her room, that's when I realized how serious it was. The police were already there, taking photos and analyzing the scene. I looked at her bed, that pillow with bloodstains. My God, it's impossible to describe what it's like to see something like this. Her room, which had always been such a welcoming and lively place, now looked like a scene from a nightmare. The investigators tried to reassure me, but you sense when things aren't going well. They had no solid leads, no signs of forced entry, no witnesses who had seen anyone entering or leaving the house. The only thing they had was blood on the pillow and some marks on the floor that suggested she had been dragged. I saw them measuring every inch of that room, asking questions of Lynda's colleagues, trying to understand what could have happened. The girls were in shock. One of them cried non-stop, saying she felt guilty for not having heard anything. I tried to be strong, but all I could think was, why didn't anyone wake up? Why didn't anyone notice? The following days were a whirlwind of unanswered questions. The police made public appeals, distributed posters with Lynda's photo. I remember looking at that smiling face on the posters, my daughter's face, and thinking, how did this happen to her? Every time the phone rang, I hoped it was good news. Maybe someone had seen something. Maybe she was alive, trying to find a way to get home. But the hours turned into days, and the days into weeks. And all we had was silence. I spent entire nights awake, trying to imagine where she was. Was she hurt? Was he scared? Was she still alive? The police did their best, but it seemed there was no way to solve the mystery. I felt like the world had stopped while my daughter was out there, lost, and I couldn't do anything to bring her back. The days turned into weeks, and there was still no news from my Lynda. I was still in Seattle, trying to stay close to the investigation, but each day without answers was like reliving the same nightmare. And that's when I started hearing whispers about other missing girls. At first, it seemed like a coincidence. Young women, students, disappearing without a trace. The police avoided saying there was a connection. They talked about different cities, different circumstances. But for me, it was impossible to ignore the similarities. They were all so similar. Young, beautiful, studying at colleges. It was as if there was a pattern that no one could unravel in time. I remember the first time I heard the name Jorgen Hawkins. She had disappeared just a few months after Lynda, just a few blocks from where my daughter lived. Another student at the University of Washington, another girl who disappeared as if swallowed by the night. And then others came, Janice Ott, Denise Nasland, and so the list went on. The investigations began to change direction. Police finally began to admit that perhaps they were dealing with something bigger. A single man, perhaps, operating in different places, using the same tactics, choosing his victims carefully. But even so, answers were slow to arrive. For me, it was like reliving the loss of Lynda every time another name was added to the list. Every time I heard about another mother crying, another family destroyed, I felt their pain as if it were my own. We were strangers, but connected by this tragedy that seemed to have no end. I started to question everything. Why didn't anyone notice before? Why didn't anyone connect the disappearances from the beginning? Could it be that if they had acted faster, my Lynda would still be alive? It was hard not to feel angry, not to want to blame someone, anyone, for the failure to stop this monster before it took more lives. And the most devastating thing was knowing that the man who did this was still free. He walked among us, perhaps planning his next attack. Every time I went out on the street, I looked into each stranger's eyes, trying to imagine, could it be him? What would I do if I knew? At that point, it wasn't just about finding Lynda. It was about stopping this killer before more families had to go through what I was going through. But time kept ticking, and he kept one step ahead. The months turned to years, and I tried to hold on to any shred of hope. Even when the news got darker, even when they told me to accept that Lynda probably wouldn't come home, I refused. How can a mother give up? I felt that as long as there was a shred of doubt, I couldn't stop believing. But then, in 1975, the truth came, and it destroyed me. Remains were found in Taylor Mountain, a remote forest in Washington state. Police were investigating other disappearances, and, when searching the area, they found human remains. At first, they didn't know who they were. They collected everything carefully, hoping forensic analysis would bring answers. I received a call from the police. They said there was a chance the remains were my Lynda. My heart stopped. I didn't know what was worse, the uncertainty or the possibility of confirming what I feared most. It was weeks before the dental exam finally revealed the truth. Some of the remains found at Taylor Mountain were those of Lynda Ann Healy, my daughter. I can't describe what it was like to hear those words. It's as if the world around me has disappeared. I was sitting there, holding the phone, but my mind couldn't process it. All I could think was, how did she get there? What did he do with her? Did she suffer? These questions torment me to this day. The police explained to me that Taylor Mountain was a place where he disposed of the bodies of his victims. It wasn't just Lynda. They found the remains of other girls who had also disappeared. Janice Ott, Denise Nasland, and others who might never be identified. I tried to listen to what the detectives were saying, but the pain was unbearable. All I could do was imagine my daughter in that cold, lonely place, abandoned as if her life had no value. They asked me if I wanted to receive the remains for a proper burial. Of course I wanted to, but how does a mother bury only part of her daughter? It felt so unfair, so incomplete. Still, I did what I could. I organized a simple ceremony, surrounded by friends and family. I wrote her a letter, telling her how much I loved her, how much I missed her, and how much I wished I could have protected her. As the earth covered the small coffin, I felt like a piece of me was being buried with it. My daughter was not just a number on a list of victims. She was Lynda, my Lynda, and he took it from me. He took everything away. Lynda's disappearance and death was not just a personal tragedy for me and our family. It was the beginning of something much bigger, something no one was prepared to face. My daughter was the first, at least the first we knew, to be taken away by that monster. But she wasn't the last. And that haunts me every day. When Lynda disappeared, no one was talking about serial killers. It was a distant, almost unreal concept. Police investigated cases as isolated events, never connecting the dots until it was too late. But over time, it became clear that there was a pattern. Young women, all with similar characteristics, disappearing without a trace. Lynda was the starting point for many investigations. His case became the center of something much bigger. Authorities began reviewing files, drawing lines between disappearances, and eventually realized they were dealing with one of the most ruthless criminals the world has ever seen. It was from there that connections began to be made. But for me, that was never enough. Sure, finding out the truth helped capture that man, but nothing would bring my daughter back. Nothing could erase the pain of knowing that other mothers went through the same thing as me. I always wondered, what if the police had noticed sooner? What if Lynda's case had been treated as more than just a disappearance? Perhaps other lives would have been saved. Maybe this nightmare would have ended sooner. For a long time, I blamed myself. I thought I had somehow failed Lynda. But over time, I realized that my pain wasn't just mine. It belonged to all the mothers, from all the families who lost their daughters to that man. And that's why I decided to speak out. I gave interviews, went on television, wrote letters to newspapers. I wanted the world to know who Lynda Ann Healy was. She wasn't just a victim. She was a brilliant young woman, a beloved daughter, a person full of dreams. Lynda's case also brought changes. He forced authorities to look at the problem differently, to work together to solve the puzzle. It was her case, and that of so many others, that opened the world's eyes to the evil that was among us. But that is no consolation. I would give anything to have my daughter back. Today, I look at the past and see a dark legacy. My Lynda was taken from me, but her story will never be forgotten. I tell your story because it's the only way I can keep it alive. And I'm hoping that maybe this will stop another mother from going through what I went through. I never imagined that I would have to live in a world where my Lynda no longer exists. Every day, I wake up with the same pain, the same feeling of emptiness that has accompanied me since the moment I knew she was gone. Life has never. It's back to the way it was before, and I believe it will never go back. I think a lot about what she could have been. Lynda had so many dreams, so many ambitions. She wanted to help people, change the world in some way. But his life was cut short in such a cruel, senseless way. I wonder, how can one person do this to another? How did he look at my daughter and see her as nothing more than an object, something to discard? I blamed myself for a long time. Questions like, what if, consumed me. What if I had called her that night? What if I had insisted that she come home for a few days? Maybe this would never have happened. But today, after so many years, I realize that this is not my fault. The only person to blame for this is him. Despite everything, I try to find a purpose. Telling Lynda's story is the only way to keep her alive. It's the only way to guarantee that your life was not in vain. If your story can help someone, if it can open the eyes of other families, other young people, then maybe something good can come of it. I also want people to know that Lynda wasn't just one of Ted Bundy's victims. No, she was my daughter. She was a unique person, full of joy, dreams, and love. This is how I want the world to remember her. And for anyone who hears this story, I hope it serves as a reminder that evil can be where we least expect it, a reminder that we must always protect each other and never assume we are completely safe. My Lynda is gone, but I carry her with me every day. In my thoughts, in my memories, in my heart. And that's where she will stay, forever.